So good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Zaya and Devika and Zaya for putting Devika and me in touch. We should have met a long time ago, but it was thanks to Zaya. I would like to take as a starting point of my presentation Geeta Kapoor's 3-page article published in 2001 called Signatures of Dissent, where she discusses 2 little magazines published in India in the 60s. Contra 61, started from Delhi by the artist J. Swaminathan, and Vrishchik, which literally means Scorpio and was literally meant to bite. Which was started from Baroda by the 2 artists, Bhupan Kakar and Ghulam Mohammed Sheikh. In this short piece, she points to 3 features of these publications, which will direct this discussion tonight. What she calls the signatures of dissent or opposition that they articulated, the space-clearing gesture they represented, and their anti-academism or anti-elitism, also mirrored in the materiality of these documents printed, for example, on the cheapest paper, brown packing paper in the case of Vrishchik. And she also calls J. Swaminathan the proverbial untutored artist. So I would like to turn to these alternative spaces founded outside of and against the cultural, literary, and artistic establishment, which I have focused on these last years because they have been one of the privileged modernist mediums in India, and the issue of modernisms in India, specifically from the vantage point of Bombay, has occupied me for some time now. From the point of view of the vantage point of Bombay and writers intimately connected to that city who started their work in the 50s and 60s. So you've got writers, a lot of these names are unfamiliar, not to everybody in the room, but a lot of these names are unfamiliar, so you've got just the names and a few photos. So writers like the bilingual English Marathi poet and graphic artist Arun Kolatkar, but also Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Adil Jasawala, Giv Patel, and others. Most of these writers that I've just quoted are poets, but the category between writers and artists was often impossible to distinguish. And a lot of the poets and writers at the time, in Amit Chaudhuri's thoughtful phrase, poached and encroached on the territory of painters. So these experimentalist, anti-commercial, mimeographed little magazines offered a space where writers and visual artists worked together, where artworks, poems, essays on art, cinema, music, or politics came together, and where a modernist idiom, signature, gesture was crafted collectively. So you've got some of these little magazines here. These publications also served as forums for these artists to connect with each other at a time when there were very few spaces or channels through which they could communicate. In that sense, they corresponded to what Raymond Williams, in another context, has called a community of the medium, to define modern artists who, having broken from mainstream institutions and from inherited communities, found the only community available to them, and he calls that a community of the medium of their own practices. So in these publications, all these artists, writers, put their own contacts, their own resources, and bypassed middlemen of art and literature, becoming the editors, the critics, and basically the promoters of each other's work. So the conspiracy of my title comes from a short text by the poet and critic Adil Jasawala, who declares, and I quote him, "We have been the only means by which poetry has been kept alive while the big publishers slept. Welcome to the conspiracy." And these words seem to echo Octavio Paz, who describes the advent of modernity as follows, and I quote him, "Poetry retreated underground, clandestine war, conspiracy in the catacombs." And as I will suggest soon, this anti-establishment conspiracy of sorts, which flourished outside of official or state support was all at once local and transnational at the same time. So just a few rapid remarks on this modernism, on the signature of modernism, which can be understood as a paradigm for emancipation and for dissent. When the painter and poet in Gujarati, Ghulam Mohammed Sheikh, speaks of himself in the 50s as a hungry soul craving for untrammeled terrains, captivated by the scent of freedom promised by the winds of the modern blowing in the air, he seems to encapsulate the spirit of the times and the spirit of a certain Bombay at the time. So the modernism that I'm interested in, and the little magazines as its privileged medium, is definitely an offshoot of the cosmopolitanism of a city like Bombay, whose demotic openness, that's an expression by Homi Bhabha, many writers, intellectuals, and artists of the 50s and 60s acknowledge. When he came back from London to Bombay in 1962, the poet Adil Jasawala recalled, and I quote him again, "the feeling of tremendous artistic potential gathering together in one place, and the feeling that Bombay was the place where it would find release." He wrote those lines in an article in Vrishchik, entitled, and I quote the title of the article, "A View of a Volcano with Various Members of the Artistic Profession Warming Their Asses on It." An article that is also a powerful charge against the elitism, escapism, and conventionalism of the art establishment in India, but more of that later. This worldliness and modernism as its expression is in turn an offshoot of the paperback revolution at the time. From the 50s onwards, books and journals from all over the world flooded the footpaths of metropolises like Bombay, those that could not make it easily to India, either because of poor distribution or censorship, were photocopied, passed around, or smuggled, a word used by Mehrotra in one of his little mags. So this modernism is really inseparable from the consumption of world, including Indian literatures in translation, or inseparable from artworks in reproduction, and crucially connected to the context. If we have time, I'll go to that point at the end of my presentation. Crucially connected to the context of the Cold War. I use the word dropout almost literally in the title of my presentation, because many of the writers and artists that I have been interested in were literal dropouts, self-taught artists or writers who shunned academic, professionalizing, and disciplined spaces. J. Swaminathan famously ran away from home in college, for example. Two other famous examples include the visual artist F.N. Souza, who was expelled from the J.J. School of Art in Bombay, and before that expelled from St. Xavier's College. And he writes, "We found it necessary to lynch the kind of art inculcated by the J.J. School of Art." Another J.J. School dropout was Arun Kolatkar, who joined, against his father's wishes, the fine arts school at the J.J. School of Art, and gave it up midway. He once described himself somewhat delightedly as the worst student of the J.J. School of Art, and also said at one point, "I'm totally anti-education. I don't believe in being taught or in teaching." I think this declaration speaks volumes of his fierce independence, of his largely self-taught skills, including the languages that the language in which he wrote. He wrote both in Marathi and in English. And English was a language that he learned not at school, but afterwards. And of his distaste for prescribed modes, creeds, assignations. It also speaks volumes of this community of the medium that strove to carve a space for itself outside the monopolistic control of what in another little magazine, is described as the priestly, academic, decadent classes in the hands of which art and literature had degenerated. The dropout, the word dropout, must also be connected, at least for the poets that I've quoted, to the international counterculture and to a surrealist, beatnik, Ginsbergian ethos. As some of you know, Ginsberg and Orlovsky had arrived in India in 1962, where they traveled for more than a year, befriending Kolatkar and the little magazine Radical Fringe of Indian poets in English, Hindi, and Bengali, especially the Hungryalists in Calcutta. In a famous essay, Alain Touraine defined counterculture as such: famille, étude, forme habituelle de la vie professionnelle, conformisme moral. Elle est d'abord le fait des drop-out, de ceux qui rompent. And in an article published in the little magazine Quest, started in 1954, you find, for example, in the 60s and 70s, articles like Sadhus and Hippies, so it's an article titled Sadhus and Hippies, which connects the two groups as bodies of social deviance and dropouts. You also have an extraordinary article with the title The Coffee Brown Boy Looks at the Black Boy, which mixes references to Du Bois, James Baldwin, Muddy Waters, Frantz Fanon, Herbert Marcuse, and others, in which the author, the Indian author, claims his identification with, I quote, the permanent reserve of misfits and rejects. And he also ends his text on the urgent need for an alternative, which can only be found in what he calls the pure logic of refusal, which he sees produced pure blues and pure jazz. So remember Sousa's comment: we found it necessary to lynch the kind of art practiced at the JJ School of Art. So the lynching or refusal, the demolition or the blasts seemed indeed crucial to cultural emancipation and to modernism, especially when modernism is inseparable from decolonization. In visual arts, like in literature, this demolition targeted two retrograde traditions: indigenism and imitativeness to Western models. It also targeted conventional bodies and national academies. Devika, you talked about the Lalit Kala Academy this morning. So it was in the pages of the little magazine Vrishchik, for instance, that the country-wide protest against the National Academy of Arts, the Lalit Kala Academy, that had been established by the government of India, in which Vrishchik contributors castigated as the organ of the establishment per se. So it was in the pages of Vrishchik that this protest was launched. They defined the institution as a hotbed of mediocrity, which failed to represent the youngest, most creative and progressive artists. In 1972, the Little Mag also published an article by F.N. Sousa, which played on the name of the Little Mag and vigorously castigated Brahmin caste segregation. And I quote the last lines of the article: "The struggle against the Lalit Kala Academy is just one battle. Now Vrishchik should fight the bearers on temple entry and let loose a nest of scorpions." So clearing a space once again, defying segregation and exclusion in multiple ways. In literature, Kolatkar, Mehrotra, and the whole little magazine crowd did blast away conventions. Oil and set the Mimeo machine like a machine gun, Mehrotra exults in one of his little mags. Modernism meant in many ways trying out different alternatives beyond the inhibiting British or Sanskrit traditions, breaking away from romantic or Victorian conventions, literary icons like Keats or Shelley, the sort, writes Mehrotra, who have their monuments in Westminster Abbey. These acts of demolition were, of course, in part fueled by the discovery of alternative Western traditions. Remember Ghulam Mohammed Sheikh speaking of himself as a hungry soul, and he also says that he was liberated by reproductions of Rothko, Soulage, etc., which he would hunt down and devour. And of course, all these poets were also liberated by the surrealists, the Beats, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, etc., etc. Our attitude of rebellion was shaped by our reading, declares Merotra, who remembers reading a book about Dada, about Cabaret Voltaire, and deciding that Bombay needed something similar. And he writes, "It was this spirit of anarchy that drew us to the movement. Nothing was sacred. The gods, whether of religion, politics, commerce, or indeed poetry, were there to be lampooned." It's important to recall that for writers, and specifically here poets who wrote in English, the signature of dissent was also articulated by the language they used. English, and it's often forgotten, is not only a language of privilege in India, but it's also the language of a minority that is viciously attacked by nativists and nationalists alike. It was also, at least in the 60s, the language of a defiant marginality. And of course, English is not just a colonial relic or the signature of colonialism, but also the language of a liberating internationalism. So Merotra, who founded two little magazines in the 60s, Damn You, a magazine of the arts, modeled on Ed Sanders' New York publication, excuse my language, Fuck You, a magazine of the arts, and Ezra writes that it was at a time when, anything in the colonial language was a red rag to a bull, that he decided to write in English. So defying the doxa at the time. I'll go rapidly on this example, but just it's impossible not to talk about the Hungryalist movement, which Parthar must know well. So this poetics of dissent is clearly articulated in the Hungryalist movement, which took the Bengali literary world by storm in the early 60s and shed light on the whole little magazine beatnik scene. One of the cyclo-styled magazines, bulletins that the Hungryalist poets published draws a list of somewhat schematic binaries, catchwords, meant to confront the demotic counter-canons of the hungry generation to the prevailing canons. So you have anti-establishment versus establishment, outsiders versus insiders, life versus art, gut language versus tutored language. Their texts and manifestos use crude sexual gut vocabulary where read in the most unusual places and distributed for free. Their English newsletter was called Waste Paper. And I don't have the time to develop, but this title, Waste Paper, speaks volumes of the aesthetics and poetics of many of these poets and artists, who constantly push the frontiers of what is acceptable or established literature, art, literary language, literary standards. Many of these writers and artists seemed to have viewed themselves as indiscriminate gluttons or rag pickers. And Kolatkar's whole poetry blurs the line between art, junk, and found objects, newspapers and poems. And even Merotra, but also Ghulam Mohammed Sheikh and others construct their art as an assemblage of quotations that are cut, recycled, poached from different traditions. That's also why Amit Chaudhuri's comment about modern poets, modern writers who bring the scrapyard into history, into art and into poetry is so relevant. So arrested, the Hungry List, many of the Hungry List were arrested for obscenity, and Ginsberg made sure that the 1964 issue of Time magazine carried the story. The Hungry Lists, in their waste paper newsletter, actually presented this trial as, and I quote them, a victimizing onslaught by the Calcutta establishment and a red-handed proof that the Bengali literati is panicked by the movement. So as the Hungry List manifestos, so many of which were published in American little mags show, and you have an example here of Guerrilla, which is an American little magazine in the 60s, and which published these manifestos. So as they show, this little magazine community of the medium was certainly eccentric, marginal, but not provincial. Everything but provincial. So in the pages of these little mags, you find text by Ginsberg, of course, John Cage, Hans Arp, Cesare Pavese, Vasco Popa, Jean Genet, Antonin Artaud, and many others. These little mags, through the publication of letters, reviews, translations, forged transnational, and especially in the case of Merotra Latkar and the Hungry Lists, American affiliations. There's therefore a similar, or at least a dialogic, signature of dissent that was articulated in Bombay, Calcutta, New York, San Francisco, and Paris. Merotra, for instance, regularly corresponded with Douglas Blazek and Howard McCord, two American poets and small press founders, whom he published in his little mags, Indian little mags, and who published him in the US. And Blazek, in one of his letters to Merotra in 1967, defines the underground ethos of these little publications, and I quote him, "Writers or magazines which are small in circulation publish material that is not generally acceptable simply because it is out of tune with what is taught," and notice that taught is underlined, "to be fashionable or correct or good or acceptable." He also writes, "We are the outsiders, the unacceptable ones, the outcasts, the outlaws. We are of the underground, who are trying to sabotage blank, sterile, worthless, brainwashed minds into thinking more intelligently, widely, gently, creatively." So all these publications, which were explicitly the art of a subculture with a limited distribution and a limited public, formed a conception of art and literature as little and lowercase. This was meant literally sometimes, since some of the texts published at the time did away with capitals, signs of punctuation, even spelling. They also abolished the frontiers between high and low, art and non-art, artists and non-artists. The manifestos on which Merotra's first issue of Ezra, Open and Close, sum up the spirit of these publications. Here, little, as in Little Magazine, stands for untutored, raw, unestablished, of course, irregular, and indeed always contrary. And I'll just quote a few lines from the manifesto that opens on the left, Ezra. "You might ask, why no capitals, why no punctuation? I meekly croak, punctuation becomes superfluous. Capitals are downright unaesthetic. Preference will be given to poets who have not yet been published before." And then at the end of this manifesto, "Be ashamed if you write philosophical poems or use the very correct English idiom. Send them elsewhere. 4-letter words and a 1-letter word will be treated equally. You like it or lump it." I'll go a little faster because I'd like to go to just a few examples of covers of Contra. For example, the cover of the first issue of Contra 66 braced the following quote Art and liberty, like the fire of Prometheus, are things that one must steal to be used against the established order. And you find on the last cover, last issue of Contra 66, another quotation, this time by the Russian writer and Soviet dissident writer Yevgeny Zamyatin. There can be real literature only when it is created not by executives and reliable civil servants, but by madmen, hermits, heretics, dreamers, and sceptics. So I'll just conclude by the context of the Cold War, which is basically what I'm interested in right now. It would need a longer development, so I'll just be as concise as possible. But I feel that these signatures of dissent, this logic of refusal fashioned by some of these little magazines, and also the space-clearing gesture that came with them, can to a certain extent also be read against the Cold War background. And that's the focus of my current research today, born from the imperative to reconsider modernisms in India and little magazines in the light of the Cold War, a background that helps to shed light on the debates, the affiliations, the negotiations, and of course the transnational and translational traffics that were taking place in the 50s and 60s. 50s and 60s, when, as the Hindi writer Mohan Rakesh acknowledged, India was also a chessboard between the United States ideologists and the USSR's ideologists. So both blocs were indeed engaged in funding a vast arsenal of cultural weapons, such as books and book programs, journals, translations, exhibitions, etc., to counter, depending on which side you were on, communist or capitalist challenge. And two institutions, the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the USIS, the United States Information Services, have played a particular important role in that cultural Cold War in India. I don't have the time to develop. But the space-clearing gesture of many Indian writers, critics, artists, and their magazine was also, or can also, be interpreted against the Cold War bipolarization of the world, to bypass official circuits, dictates, or influences of officially endorsed or government-sponsored cultures. Justin Quinn talks about the unquenchable thirst for unofficial art from the late 60s onwards on both sides of the Iron Curtain after the height of the Cold War, and the attraction for expressions disdained by the great eminences of the American intelligence, which is also an alignment with the international counterculture I talked about earlier. The anti-Vietnam movement is actually regularly featured in a little mag like Vrščik. A 1970 issue of the magazine, for instance, published a selection of letters sent by an American GI in Vietnam, which, as the editorial declares, mock at the fake capsules of humanity presented to us by the glamorous propaganda of the big nations. And the editorial ends by the following phrase: "It is high time for the young nations to rise and challenge the supremacy of great powers." In a joint letter published in the Times of India, Adil Jasawala, Giv Patel, and others announced that they have refused an invitation to read at the American Cultural Center, and I quote them, "We question the American government's abatement of genocide on the one hand and its various programs for cultural exchange on the other. They also call for an alternative reading of writers who have spoken out against tyranny and who have not been curtain filtered by institutions like the Congress for Cultural Freedom or the USIS. The official state-sponsored and curtain-filtered art or literature is exactly the one against which writers such as Kolatkar, Josawala or Merotra have positioned themselves. In an article called Boys and Girls in Purda, an article published in 1972 in a Bombay student periodical, Adil Josawala attacks the Purda behind which his students access culture and literature. And I quote a few lines from this article. It is tragic that we do not see that during the passage of any art from the colonizer's country to us, a dreadful dilution takes place. Sometimes it takes place at the source. Castration, then, is the better word for it. Art, as presented by various international agencies like the UCIS or the British Council, is simply art with its balls removed. Interestingly, Josawala's comment seems to correspond to Greg Barnazel's contention that modernism was defanged to be used as a Cold War weapon. It is a well-known fact that modernism was sponsored during the Cold War as a token of the freedom that Western citizens and artists enjoy. But modernism was also purged of its rebelliousness and radicalism, especially of its hostility towards bourgeois culture. So, of course, the curtain in Josawala's article is also the Purda of English, both the language into which world literatures make it to India and the very correct English used by most Indians. Language, art, and literature are not just selected, but indeed castrated. The violence, the culturally or politically radical are kept at bay. And Josawala adds, what filters through that curtain is only fit for the international shitpot. And it's precisely because of that dilution that in the same text, Adil Josawala calls for the living acid of contemporary Indian writers in English to eat the curtain away. So if the marginal, anti-elitist, anti-academic spaces of little magazines effectively created a decentered literary universe, it's in more sense than one. Of course, these magazines circulated across the world from periphery to periphery, subculture to subculture, but they also dismissed both blocks. And I would like to end on two beautiful texts by Merotra, which are actually manifestos, in Damn You, a magazine of the arts, which are extraordinary literary texts as well. And I don't have the time to, Do I have just a little time, just to finish?
Can you choose excerpts?
2 minutes?
Just excerpts.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I'd like to end on these manifestos of Merotra's little magazines, which illustrate this space-clearing gesture, this quest for the means of political, cultural, and literary freedom or independence. Damn You, and I'm here reading from the image on the left, is not the mouthpiece of a writer, a clan, a government, a party, and I quote him, not the organ of a hungry generation, a clan of anti-poets, a writer's workshop. And then he continues, we are illiterates, unaware of isms. We are men breathing, and we breathe for ourselves, not for the age we live in. And I'll just end by 3 lines. Dig in, which is actually, I don't remember exactly where it is, but dig in, make zigzag trenches, fire back, oil and set the Mimeo machine like a machine gun. Fuck politics. Damn You, has nothing to do with collapsible governments. Ken Gearing, the editor of Breakthrough, thinks we are Yankee-oriented. A Yankee, Eric Oatman, who edits the Manhattan Review, writes, the name is too damn British, and so we like to keep them guessing and leave the capitals of the skyscraping earth to decide amongst themselves. And I love this last line.
Thank you very much. Je m'exprimerai en français. Oui, Rejoignez-nous. Merci beaucoup à toutes les deux, à Chungaivo et à Laetitia Zecchini. Vous avez lancé énormément de pistes hein, dans cette communication. Je n'aurai pas le temps de toutes les reprendre et j'espère qu'on aura des questions. Il y a notamment Amit Chaudhry qui a été mentionné plusieurs fois dans le texte qui nous a rejoints. Une question, alors déjà une remarque, la citation de Picasso en couverture de Contrastictiques en anglais, mais on ne s'attend pas à retrouver Picasso dans ce contexte-là, même si évidemment c'est une figure très importante dans l'entre-deux-guerres, on connaît ses alignements politiques à ce moment-là en tous les cas. Bref, une chose sur laquelle vous pouvez peut-être revenir, parce que c'est pas évident quand on n'est pas spécialiste, c'est vous avez fait un commentaire sur la langue anglaise qui n'est pas uniquement en tous les cas la langue coloniale, uniquement la langue de la domination, mais qui est aussi justement cette langue utilisée pour clear space, cette langue utilisée par la contre-culture, et ça vous l'avez cité fantastiquement, à quel point elle est réimaginée en Inde, mais c'est pas seulement ça, c'était un point de vue, c'était un commentaire historique et sociologique. Ouais. Est-ce que vous pouvez développer un petit peu là-dessus ?
En français, du coup.
Comme vous le souhaitez.
Oui, non, c'est-à-dire que certes, l'anglais est une langue coloniale, est une sorte de vestige ou de vestige colonial, mais en effet, ce qu'on oublie souvent, c'est que c'est ce que je disais, c'est-à-dire que c'est aussi la langue de l'émancipation, c'est aussi la langue de l'internationalisme, c'est aussi la langue à travers laquelle artistes et écrivains indiens ont accès à la littérature monde, à l'art mondial. Et c'est une langue qui est attaquée violemment aujourd'hui encore en Inde, qui était attaquée dès les années 40, dès l'indépendance, dès les années 50 et 60. Donc Merotra fait référence au Angrezi Hatao Movement, donc c'est le mouvement pour se débarrasser de l'anglais, voilà, c'est ça. Mais il faut savoir que, ce nationalisme peut dériver et dérive encore aujourd'hui dans une sorte de nativisme virulent où tout ce qui n'est pas, indigène, justement, où la catégorie d'indigénisme devient une catégorie extrêmement violente pour condamner, attaquer, et parfois attaquer physiquement, tous ceux qui, effectivement, s'expriment en anglais au lieu de s'exprimer dans les langues dites vernaculaires ou, ont un art, d'ailleurs que ce soit des artistes ou des écrivains, un art trop, occidentalisé, donc non indien, donc antinational. Voilà, bon, et c'est des questions qui me sont chères, puisque c'est des questions auxquelles de nombreux artistes ou écrivains que je connais sont confrontés. Voilà.
S'il y a des questions in English or in French? Oui.
Yes. You said that you mentioned that Gainsbourg actually lived in Calcutta.
I mentioned that he spent a year in India and the longest time in Calcutta. Yeah.
So why circulation of this little magazines?
Why? Sorry.
How wide was the circulation?
How wide? I can't give you figures or numbers. But what is absolutely certain is that a limited audience, definitely, a limited readership in India itself, definitely. But the Little Magazine movement, I talked mainly of the English Little Magazine movement and a little bit of the Bengali and a little bit of the Marathi, but I'm familiar with English only. But it happened in many other languages than English, of course. And there were circulations between, for example, Ashok Shahane in Bombay was an intermediary between the Bengali Little Magazine movement and the Marathi Little Magazine movement, and there were translations of texts by Little Magazine writers or poets, in the different languages. So that happened, but it was a limited readership. I mean, it was, as I said, a signature of marginality or outsiderness, but at the same time, A lot of these texts, definitely the Hungryalist manifestos, definitely texts by Merotra, Kolatkar, and others, were published in the US. And some of them were translated.
You'll be there also. Wonderful. It's such a lot. And one just question to Charlie. And you talk about in art school. So they actually started with the fun print, graphic arts, also illustrating Nuri magazine, of course fitted very well with the capability movement. Would you say that? Later, of course, this is, with art school, they started with graphic arts.
Are you talking about the drawing, school? Yes.
And then could later on, help with the movement, the revolution and so on.
Oh, right. I think so those so-called vocational schools were founded in response to practices that actually were already existing. But what my interpretation is that in the transformation or the disposition from what already exists into an institution was to transform those skills into skills that could be commodified, right? And so, for example, there was all these traditions of woodblock printing or of drawing or ceramic work, but then when it gets filtered through the schools, it becomes skills that you can use to make a living, right?
More institutionalized.
Yes, more institutionalized, and also, I think, simplified, right? And so, for example, the teaching of the motifs, right? So certain motifs get transformed into so-called traditional patterns, but what gets lost is the way that, say, a dragon's tail actually, when it's produced for a rooftop, each of them is very different, right? But because students are taught to make these curves, and so those images get simplified over time, and then the skills themselves are lost, right? Yeah.
One question about lacquer work, because some of the artists you distinguish as excelling in lacquer work, the examples you showed were actually oil on canvas. So was this sort of a parallel practice that they had? How does one sort of connect the two? Were they in conflict sometimes?
Oh.
Or did they sort of...
Yes, so...
I could see from some examples that, of course, some artists were using both techniques.
Yes, so I was showing both. So there was lacquer work in terms of wingyeti, the representations of the women symbolizing the seasons, or wingsang, the image of the soldiers who meet at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. But yes, I also showed images of gouache, or of oil painting or watercolor. Yes, I mean, all of these were parallel practices. But what was considered indigenous is the lacquer painting. And for me, I find that the most interesting because it was considered an indigenous medium, but it becomes valued through the art academy. Okay? And it becomes something actually that is identified as Vietnamese later on by North Vietnamese nationalists.
Léa, tu as un commentaire?
Oh, and just also an addendum to what you're saying, your observation about the oil painting. And so even though lacquer painting becomes a very sophisticated medium, oil painting is still seen as, yes, the epitome
Right.
of the artist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Léa, tu veux répondre?
Presentation, because it's true, some student was a very great artist after, you know. That's why I'm very surprised by this. The story of the school and the student of the school is really apart in the story of the school of art and the colonization.
Yeah, I mean,
Institution.
I think to your point, the Q&A, you know, that follow after your presentation, the school, yes, was an instrument of mission civilisatrice, but it doesn't mean that the students who come out of that are robots. Right? It's not like you just learn this and then you reproduce it simplistically. I mean, yes, you do see the influence of the French academic training. I mean, how can you not? But what they create out of those tools that they learn is something very different. And you see that in even the oil paintings, you know, even the watercolors. I mean, if we just trace the development of socialist realism, I mean, that is something you don't see in China or in the Soviet Union, you know, in the Eastern Bloc. I mean, it's a very distinct brand or style of Vietnamese socialist realism. And it's not as though they knew what socialist realism was. Right? You see these debates in the 1940s in the periodicals when they're trying to figure it out. And it's through them creating works that they think the party will sanctify that you start seeing what becomes known as Vietnamese socialist realism. And even then, you know, in a lot of the posters that were chosen for reproduction, you see the bulky bodies and kind of the parallels between the human and the machine. But the images that I showed you, you don't see that. And a lot of those artists, you know, resisted. You know, they couldn't fully resist. They still had to show, like, or represent the proletariat or the peasant. But they don't actually, if you look at the way that they portray the body, they don't really go to socialist realism full-fledged.
Thank you. S'il y a d'autres questions, comments, questions? Alors, on continuera de toute façon le débat, on aura l'occasion autour d'un verre de vin, et je suis consciente qu'on a dépassé le temps, les verres de vin nous attendent dehors. Et en guise de conclusion, c'est une journée d'études qui lance des pistes en vue d'un colloque. Je voulais juste reprendre quelques mots-clés dont plusieurs intervenants se sont saisis et nous ont invités, je pense, à les travailler, donc comme des pistes que je lance plutôt pour le futur et qui entrecoupent voilà, l'académie, la contre-académie. On a parlé énormément d'identité, de création d'identité, y compris dans les écoles coloniales, avec ce paradoxe qui a fait débat, mais qui était très intéressant à la fois dans la communication de Zahia Rahmani et de Chung Dai-vo. On a parlé d'émancipation et d'indépendance, et c'était évidemment les notions qui ont travaillé à la fois la communication de Laetitia Zecchini d'une certaine façon, même si c'était après l'indépendance, mais c'était une nouvelle forme d'émancipation, mais aussi ce matin d'Elvan Zabunian, évidemment de contre-culture et énormément de langue et de langage. Car même lorsqu'on a une vocation ici, principalement à l'INHA, de parler de langage visuel, je pense que la façon dont ces champs s'entrecoupent est quelque chose avec lequel on a terminé la journée. Ça m'était cher. Et donc, je vous remercie à toutes et à tous pour vos contributions aujourd'hui. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.